First, I'd like to thank you so much, all of you, Professor Nishi and Kira Ozaki and Ekana Matsumoto, whom I've been in contact with, coming here. It's a great pleasure to be invited to a country where I visited once many, many years ago, and only for a couple weeks. And not even a couple of weeks, and I've been very, very curious about Japan and Japanese anthropology in general. There is, as you know, not very much contact between American and anthropologists and Japanese anthropologists. There should be much more. I did meet a number of anthropologists from Japan in Germany on several occasions. But it seems that it isn't happening as much as it should, and I hope it will improve. I should say at the beginning that this is the first time that I've decided to write about contemporary politics. I find that it is impossible to be neutral. Though neutrality does not necessarily exclude objectivity if one recognizes one's bias. I begin that way simply because as an American, admittedly someone who spent maybe half his life abroad, I am caught within the spirit of what is happening in the United States with the political situation with President Trump, if I have to use the title. And it's impossible, really, for anybody living in the United States, whether for Trump or against Trump, not to talk about Trump. Every dinner, people vow not to talk about Trump, and they talk about Trump. In the newspapers, the television, the blogs, and so on. It's a continual bombardment and speculation of what is happening. So I say this now because I want you to listen to what I'm saying, not just simply as a paper in which I'm discussing a scientific project, as for example, trance in Morocco, or but also as a symptom of what I'm talking about. I too am a product of the effect that Trump has produced. So please listen with two ears. One to what I have to say intellectually, theoretically, and one in terms of, look, this is an American talking, and he can't help but talk about Trump. And maybe he's all wrong, and maybe you'll find me all wrong, but at least I can take pleasure at least in the security of being a symptom. And I think it's important to recognize that. Certainly, there's a change in the United States that's gone on since before his election, and that really related to the fact that the Anthropological Association has been much more activist since then. Last year, in the meetings in Washington, half the papers, it seemed to me anyway, many of the papers had to do with the effect of Trump's politics. And there was a panic in the air. And indeed, one of the sessions, the session I was in, was not actually held at the hotel, but actually in the Congressional Hall. And there were members or staff from Congress who actually participated in those meetings. And I must say, they were quite impressive. What has happened, I suppose we could say, is that what Trump has produced is beside himself, I mean, it's certainly not his conscious purpose, but what he did was to create a kind of epistemological crisis in the United States. something that I think most Americans were not particularly concerned about, as I think most people are not necessarily concerned about epistemological crises. But through his talk of false news, false facts, alternate facts, he's created a kind of what I call an epistemological whirlpool. And that is basically the underlying subject of my talk today. It's difficult to imagine the effect that this can produce when people really are caught in a situation where they don't really know, have a feeling that they're disengaged, they don't know what's happening, life is completely unpredictable, things have happened that are quite extraordinary and have affected then the general atmosphere of the country. And I would like to suggest also a number of feeling states, affective states, that are there. Some of them surprising, and one I'll mention, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is a strange sense of nostalgia for something else, and also a loneliness that occurs. That people lost something of the, how can I put it, the affective trust that they normally have. And of course this is exacerbated by the extraordinary division that has occurred in the country. It's a very different division than occurred during the war in Vietnam. There were two definable sides, and people had something that they could specifically address. Here, it's very difficult to know what you're addressing other than the person of Trump, and of course that's not satisfactory in any more larger sense. Before proceeding with my particular argument, I would like to say something about affect studies generally. I have to admit a certain skepticism, not on the need to study affect, its expression and evaluation, but on the sloppiness of some of the studies. The number of approaches to definitions of and attributions of affect in affect theory is dizzying. I make no claim in this brief prelude to my talk today to give an order to affect. My remarks are cautionary. Most of the studies I have read, especially those of biological and psychological nature, seem indifferent to the way different cultures conceptualize and evaluate affect, and the range of associated experiences, emotions, feelings, moods, sentiments, etc. Though they recognize the difficulty of defining affect, they usually offer one or even more than one without recognizing that the indefinability, at least the difficulty of defining affect, is in fact an important feature of affect. I am not necessarily advocating a Wittgensteinian approach to affect, but the study of the way affect, the word affect, is used in both ordinary conversation and specialized studies. How does its significance change with changes of context? How does its affect affect the context? What are the central affects or emotions in both ordinary and scholarly discourse? Spinoza passed through the interpretive filter of Deleuze, stresses sadness and fear. Others might single out love. How does it affect action? Spinoza asks repeatedly. Does one in fact use the term affect in daily conversation? When I became interested in it, I began to listen ordinary conversations, not necessarily scholarly conversations, but indeed scholarly conversations that were not directed to affect. And I came to realize that the term was very rarely used. People talked about moods, they talked about emotion, they talked about being moved by, and so on. But the very term affect was a relatively restrictive term. I don't know whether or not this is true in Japanese, and it's certainly, in my impression, certainly true in other the countries of Europe that I know, and in which I know the language. I wonder if my observations would be the same in Japan. What is the semantic aura around whatever words you use for affect? Does it have the dual sense of being affected by, that is, a passive sense, and an active one, to affect something? However you answer, you can see how deeply embedded affect and the constellation of associated concepts are embedded in grammar, and by extension, the psychology embedded in that grammar. Such theorists who see affect studies as a palliative to the dryness of post-structuralist studies ignore the role of language. Often they describe affect as preconceptual. It may be, but it is, I have to stress, as I have in some of my work, to point out and stress the fact that affect occurs in a linguistically endorsed world. That is to say, in a world which is already organized within a language or linguistic terms. Most often, when Europeans and Americans speak of context, they are referring to the immediacy of the situation in which an event, a conversation, a mood, or an action occurs. What is less frequent is any reference to how the context is framed and evaluated, the etiquette that framing and evaluation presupposes. By etiquette, I mean more than the appropriate behavior or manners, but also an etiquette of perception. What we ought to see, hear, smell, taste, or touch, and under what circumstances. In New York, for example, if you go to the concert hall at Carnegie Hall, you will hear the noise, the rumble, in the middle of the concert of a subway underground. This can be very irritating if it's very loud, but most people, most of the time, simply adjust very quickly to not hearing it and simply are moved by the music. So I think it's very important to realize that it's not just a simple cultural thing, but really there is a kind of etiquette as to what you can and can't deal with. There have obviously been books by historians on the subject, particularly French historians, dealing, for example, with the perception of odor. The contexts, of course, I should state, are never static, though they are usually taken, at least in the United States, as a constant. The framing of an event and its experience are never fully synchronized and should not be collapsed one into the other. The tension between them, one might say, is affectively creative. I have already mentioned the psychology embedded in language. I could not have simply said the implicit and explicit psychology is prevailing in a society. Spinoza is frequently mentioned in affect studies, most often without asking what is the nature of his, quote, psychology, unquote, if there is one, in any way comparable to what we mean today by psychology. In other words, are affectus and affectus, affectio and affectus psychological terms. However modern we might like to make Spinoza, we have to be careful not to read him through lenses of romanticism and post-romanticism that have deeply penetrated our own folk and even academic psychologies that we take for granted. Such notions as depth, self, innerness, subjectivity, intersubjectivity, and emotionality. We see a vacillation in affect studies between psychological approaches and non-mentalistic ones in which affect is characterized as simply intensity or force. Brian Massumi, like Deleuze and perhaps Spinoza, stresses the temporal, the anticipatory dimension of affect. The affective stance can be characterized in terms of what I would call promptitude, a readiness to be acted upon and to act, Of course, the expectant stance is continually punctuated by feelings and emotions that arise in response to situational and proprioceptive changes. We must not forget that social life is characterized by suspense, a binding suspense, perhaps. It certainly figures in affective resonance, the mirroring and echoing in any social engagement and the action that follows. Now, my focus in the remainder of this lecture is on the production of a sense of anomie through the manipulation of affect and feelings, moods, and emotions that follow. Although anomie is usually understood impersonally, as in Durkheim, as the product of contradictory social conditions, I want to stress that the production of affective anomie can be a means to personal empowerment. I am not denying the role of social and economic forces in creating the necessary conditions for an individual to assume power, but my interest is how power seekers can produce and manipulate anomic or chaotic conditions for their own benefit, but are subject to the very anomie they produce. I will compare, as odd as it may seem, curing ceremonies I observed in Morocco with the chaotic conditions that Donald Trump has produced in the United States and beyond its borders. I am certainly not claiming that Trump is a shaman, though some anthropologists, most notably Keir Martin and Jacob Krause Jensen, have likened him to one. It is their common practice, despite their very different goals, that interests me. I hope that their unpredictable, unconventional, and contradictory behavior, which often appears at odds with their ostensible goals and the authority they seek, produces an intense cognitive vertigo or affective anomie in their audiences, that they can assume power over them, if only by offering them a stable orientation point. I should note that it has been claimed that people living in chaotic conditions are particularly and uncritically suggestible. They can be likened to the shipwrecked who will desperately grab whatever flotsam is around. My earliest extended field work, as some of you know, was in Morocco with the Hamaja, members of a Islamic confraternity, or tariqa, that specialized in exorcisms. Their appeal was to the urban poor, many, most of whom had moved from the countryside to cities in search of work. The Hamacha were known for their spectacular cures of those believed to be suffering from attack or possession by a jinn, an irascible, essentially amoral spirit, who was quick to attack anyone who has offended it. The curing ceremonies were long, highly dramatic, dissonant events in which a band of professional musicians played on flutes and oboes, accompanying insistent drumming, melodic phrases that were said to be pleasing to the possessing spirits, while the possessed danced in deep trance. The curer would egg on, that is, encourage his patients, sometimes gently, sometimes violently, often thrashing about in a threatening manner until the patient fell unconscious and was revived by the curer, often, in my experience, symptom-free. Although the ceremonies were centered on the patient, some of the onlookers would also fall into trance when they heard a musical phrase dear to the jinn who had once taken possession of them, and thereby provoking further confusion in the ritual itself. Some men slashed their heads, their scalps with knives until their heads were drenched in blood. Exorcisms did not aim at ridding the possessed of the possessing spirit once and for all, but rather in transforming it from a malign into a beneficent one. That is, so long as its commands were obeyed. These commands might include wearing certain colors, always dancing to the spirit's favorite musical phrase, making the annual pilgrimage to a shrine, or sponsoring a yearly ceremony. If the commands were not followed, the possessed would be attacked again. I want to focus on one curer because he best illustrates my argument Candice was the most famous cure in McNair's when I worked there. His reputation rested on his successful cures and his unorthodox methods. In fact, he was viewed with great ambivalence, suspicion even, but never seen as dangerous. His techniques were unpredictable, at times grotesque. I have seen him argue angrily with a jinn who had taken possession of an adolescent girl and refused to reveal its identity or its desires, and then turn on the girl, insulting her, at times whipping her with a switch, accusing her of lying, screaming that she was pretending to be possessed. Given that the girl was voicing the spirit, and the spirit the girl, it was never clear whom Candice was addressing. He exploited the confusion. The barrage of contradictions was dizzying. When the confusion climaxed, the jinn announced its identity, at least Candice said it did, and demanded a full exorcism, which the girl's family could not afford. Finally, Candice performed a simple one with an oboe player and a drummer in the middle of a public square in the afternoon. Exorcisms are usually performed at night. The spirit departed, Candice announced, but on condition that a larger ceremony be held. A few days later, I saw the girl in an exorcism for a man who had been slapped, in quotes, by an angry jinn and was suffering from facial paralysis. Candice suddenly saw her, charged her, jumped around her, shouted at her, at the jinn, and when the jinn refused to leave her, he dipped a chunk of hardened sugar in the blood from a sacrificed goat and forced her to eat it. Though ingesting blood is haram for Muslims, no one was shocked at the time, caught as they were in the act. The shock came later. I have no idea whether the exorcism lasted, as the girl's family sent her back to their village. Candice was always playing with reality. Before interviewing him, I never knew how he would react. The first time he answered my questions with exceptional insight. The second time his answers did not relate to my questions. But upon reviewing my notes, I realized that he had answered them all, but out of order. On another occasion, he refused to say a word at all. And still another, he beat me with his switch to make his point. He was clearly brilliant, perhaps the most brilliant man I've ever met. He played with both within and without the ritual conventions, but they were never in doubt. With me, where there was no set interview conventions, I, and I believe Candice, were caught in a vertiginous reality, saved, as it were, by shared playfulness. When I described Candice's antics to psychiatrists, Western psychiatrists, they immediately declared him schizophrenic. I could not convince them otherwise. Candice's individual behavior superseded consideration of context and conventions, even clearly demarcated ritual ones. I have to admit that this was particularly difficult in Candice's case, since he was not only breaking conventions, but also breaking the conventionality of conventions. By transgressing these meta-conventions, he was calling attention to the conventions and the overriding power of their sacrality. Diagnostics was, for the psychiatrists, a means, a defense against that which defied their conventional understanding. In many respects, Donald Trump's behaviors, as serious, indeed, as dangerous as their consequences may be, resemble in dramatic form, but obviously not in substance and intent, those of Candice. Substance and intent aside, there are important differences that can have consequences, I suggest, of even greater import than their immediate effect on those that are subject to them. They can backfire. As I am primarily interested in the effect of anomic conditions on the people who are affected by it, I will only discuss Trump's tactics and strategies briefly. I use tactics and strategies with caution, since, as I shall argue, anomic conditions put in question any attribution of intention. They are, however, ascribed continually and unquestioningly in the media by both commentators and satirists, who have grown by political scientists, by ordinary people, and this began even before he was elected president. More important, perhaps, is the near obsessive discussion of Trump's latest acts. No president of the United States has ever received as much media coverage as Trump. Let me briefly discuss some of his anomic producing practices. They will probably be familiar to you, as his positions change from day to day, often dramatically. Any discussion of them immediately gives them a false stability, a specifiable intentionality, and a realistic expectation. Under these circumstances, prediction, always at the top of the limit of speculation, can reach speculative heights that so defy realism that their speculative nature has to be bracketed off, if not fully denied. So noted, I discussed some of Trump's most effective maneuvers, recognizing it is at times impossible to determine any integrating goal other than his presumable desire for power, fame, wealth, and the preservation of his presidency. And drawing it as Trump, there is no, in Trump's use of the media, there is no dialogical engagement. He simply tweets, which, as my wife puts it, are like the voice of God coming from nowhere. What explanation he offers is rarely an explanation, but simply an unsubstantiated pronouncement. Evidence lies in the fact that he has said it. They are performatives, vaulted to be sure by the reality he evokes and his disregard for consistency. Vested in his authority as president, they still have a performative force that loops back on itself, performing, as it were, their performativity. Were he to rationalize his inconsistencies, explain away his contradictions, and justify his sudden turnabouts, they would lose their force. It is as though every pronouncement is an isolate, independent of every other. When they are ineffective, when they are ineffective or contradictory, they are left to fall out of memory. Trump, as several of the people who work with him say, delights in chaos and confusion. The production of chaos and confusion draws attention to him, since only he has the key to it, if indeed he has it. Any public challenge to his particular, if momentary version of reality, Trump dismisses as false news. He repeatedly excoriates the press, turning it into an enemy bent on destroying him. Recently, as his standing, if not his office, is threatened, he has begun to accuse dark forces in the government hell-bent on destroying him. His counterattacks are, however, directed at individuals, reporters, members of the intelligence community, those engaged in investigating his relations with the Russians, immigrants, and Muslims, or at specific institutions like CNN and the FBI that he personifies in his rantings. They are, to the juggler, demeaning, insulting, vulgar, racist, peppered with sexual slurs, as we've seen this week in terms of the hearings on the Supreme Court, mainly addressed to women, and unsupported accusations such as Muslims are terrorists and Mexican immigrants are criminals and rapists. He taunts them, sneers at them, jeers at them, calling them names like Crooked Hillary for Hillary Clinton, or Scumbag Comey for the FBI head he fired. The way children taunt each other with tags like Fat Mary or Pretty Tommy. Infantile, they are repeated at every mention of them without regard to context. He does not seem to realize that he is in fact demeaning himself, as apparently many of his supporters don't, in repeating these tags. As Levi-Strauss observed, in open naming systems, he who names himself. There is no order to Trump's ranting. What is extraordinary and rarely noticed is that his depictions of his enemies, their values, thoughts, and acts, mirror how he himself is characterized by them. In a form of reversed echolalia, repetition substitutes for evidence. It is enforced by his rage, a bullying raid that by breaking presidential etiquette seems to be read by his supporters as a sign of power rather than a sign of weakness. He plays on a nihilistic, anti-intellectual, violent undercurrent, but weakly suppressed in right-winged American individualism, indeed, in my view, the whole country. In its demand for freedom, This is decisively depicted by a wonderful novel by Cormac McCarthy called Blood Meridian. Like an illusionist, Trump plays with reality, producing an epistemological tumble down. Already in The Art of the Deal, published in 1987, he advocated what he called then, or the person who wrote it for him, hyperbole of facts as a deal-making device, and his advisor, Kellyanne Conroy, attempted to explain away his false accounts, exaggerations, and lies as alternate facts, ruffling conventional standards of veracity. Trump ignores his own production of false facts, if indeed he does not con himself into believing them. It could be argued that he has conflated rhetoric, his rhetoric, with reference. Reference, unlike rhetoric, is subject to truth, conditional logic. Rhetoric is, as Socrates knew, prone to trickery. Persuasion substitutes for truth evaluation, even when truth figures rhetorically. This is not to say that rhetoric is simply persuasive, for it functions not only to convince, but to subtly change the context and thereby the significance of the referential. Trump is attracted to the unseemly, the less than legal, the swamp, the corruptions he promised to do away with in his campaign, as had been dramatically revealed in papers just 2 or 3 days ago, that finally cited the fraudulent tax evasion that he has done. He is drawn to autocratic leaders like Putin, Kim Jong-un, Netanyahu, and Rodrigo Duterte, but will turn on them when it suits his purpose. The law, and indeed the American Constitution, which he has apparently never read, appears to be simply obstacles to achieving his goals. He does not seem to grasp the balance of powers and tries to interfere with the independence of the legislature and now the judiciary. He has no qualms about breaking tradition, conventions, and even the law. He refused and still refuses to show his taxes. In The Art of the Deal, he asked, actually, when he was being inaugurated and the president is supposed to swear over the Bible, he asked if he could swear over his own book. It was refused. He has withdrawn or threatened to withdraw security clearances from people whom he considers his enemies, even President Obama, solely on political grounds. His conduct at diplomatic and political meetings is malapert. He arrives late without an apology, pushes his way in front of other heads of state, interrupts them, mimics them, and has no concern for appropriate etiquette. He has refused to divest or put business in fully blind trust, and he promotes his own business interests at political and diplomatic meetings. His political speeches have little substance. Rather, they are self-eulogizing rallies or occasions to vent his rage against whoever happens to be the enemy of the day. Even when his meetings are considered failures by their participants, he declares them great, the greatest success ever, and is wont to break whatever promises he made within hours. He arrives at them unprepared, without consulting experts, who he often mocks, as he knows best. His main source of news is Rupert Murdoch's ultra-right Fox News, and he is said to depend primarily on one commentator in particular, Sean Hannity, for policy decisions, as he depended at the beginning of his presidency on the irascible alt-right Steve Bannon. Most of his political appointments are made on the basis of loyalty and their willingness to agree with whatever he says, and not on expertise. Like an illusionist, he plays with reality. For the starting of his presidency, he has broken treaties, ignored long-standing commitments, disrupted trade agreements that threaten the world economy and the most fundamental moral values, as, for example, the separation from their parents of the children of banned immigrants. There are thousands still in cages in Texas, although he denies that this is the case. His responses are off the cuff, without any regard to long-term consequences. His sense of the future seems to be limited to near time, except presumably when it concerns his own fame. I could, of course, continue to discuss Trump's maneuvers, such the kind of conversations that populate the country. But then I would be participating in the effects he produced. So we'll stop with that aspect of it. What is important is the inescapability is reinforced by his modes of communication. What I'm arguing is basically he's created almost a kind of claustrophobic situation in which it's almost impossible to escape, and where there's very little dialogical response, if indeed there's any. It is he, and he alone, who has the power to respond. When he does, his responses are rarely directed at the issues at stake, but are simply further pronouncements, often self-eulogizing or attacks on his opponents, even when they have nothing to do with the issue in question. Deflection is the rule. Trump's followers may find security in his style, as they may find comfort in God's word. This would be especially true of the conservative evangelicals who are among the most ardent supporters, despite his blasphemous outbursts and his, in their eyes, sinful acts. I am not speaking here of the biblical allusions planted in many of George W. Bush's speeches. If they occur in Trump's, they are ornamental cliches. The evangelicals' support of Trump is pragmatic and issue-specific. A means, for example, to end the right to abortion or stop immigrants and terrorists from entering the country. It should not be dismissed as greed, as many of his opponents suggest. Mike Pence, the Christian fundamentalist vice president, stands beside him as at his signings of legislation as a sort of totemic guarantor of the righteousness of, or at least the necessity for, whatever bill he is signing. His presence does not comfort Trump's opponents. Indeed, it inspires fear of his becoming president, which many consider would be worse than Trump's presidency. This is not to say that Trump's supporters are not without fears of his impeachment. His supporters do not seem to grasp the long-term consequences of his acts, his denial of global warming, his arbitrary breaking of the Iran Treaty without any concern for what it has accomplished, or its effect on Middle Eastern politics, his tax cuts on the poor, his Supreme Court appointments, his reducing and redirecting funds for education and health care, his rescinding of environmental protection legislation, his warmongering, his trade warring, his threats to end support for NATO, coupled with his veneration of Putin, and of course the effect of his acts on America's reputation and influence. That America first really means Trump first has become a cliche. It also marks an indifference and ignorance of much of the country to the rest of the world, as any reader of a local newspaper or viewer of local television in America knows, except, of course, when it impinges directly on their lives. And even then, many supporters of Trump's policies are not in their own interests. Whether it is intended or not, the conflict between the two positions, the rapid division between the Trumpites and his anti-Trump people, produces a radical division in the country, one which gives little comfort to either side, for they both suffer from the lack of the communitarian sentiment of unity that any kind of nationalism inspires. This sentiment does not necessarily require agreement, but the possibility of engagement. A deep-seated sense of isolation, a sort of loneliness, is coupled with anger and hostility. Family members who have different views of Trump avoid each other or vow not to talk politics in their relations. Friendships are broken, and there are fights in bars and political rallies that have led to killings. Trump's opponents argue that he has provoked them, and not without some reason. The range, intensity, and erotic quality of affect, which I am citing here, which I'm calling here as affective anomie, are enormous. There is little certainty. Each day Trump acts on several of the accommodations of the previous day. He offers no grounding. His unpredictability, his failure to follow traditional conventions, his hyperbole, his falsifying accounts of what happened, his lying, his about-faces, his dramatic shifts of mood, his rages, his personal attacks, his failures to give evidence for his pronouncements, his inability to engage in dialogue, his pretense. Is it a pretense that he actually believes his pronouncements and the reality they imply preclude attributions of intention and a sense of expectable future? And yet, attributions of intention are made and acted upon in terms of the expectable future by politicians, by people in the financial world, by academics. They require continual recalibration. There are certain positions he holds with tenacity, and yet he often acts in ways that undermine them. Uncertainty, mistrust, and doubt are pervasive, however strongly his supporters resist them. It may well account for their inflexibility, and indeed that of his opponents, whose opposition is equally solid and unyielding. Each side has their own view of Trump, the one that he is ruthless pragmatist, whose indifference to tradition, convention, and even values they themselves hold demonstrates his strength, courage, and promise. The other insists there is something wrong with him mentally. They throw out one diagnosis or another. He has been called narcissistic, paranoid. These are terms I've taken from newspaper articles and the like, sometimes by the same author. He has been called narcissistic, paranoid, manic, delusional, a pathological liar, schizophrenic, psychopathic, sociopathic, and just plain crazy or nuts. Some claim he is suffering from attention deficit disorders, Asperger's syndrome, the beginnings of Alzheimer's disease or senile psychosis, or that he is addicted to cocaine. These diagnoses are bandied about without requisite expertise and examination. They are defensive, as are many diagnoses, providing an illusory external vantage point, an escape from Trump's encompassing omnipresence and its dizzying effect. Whatever truth any of the diagnoses may have, they are essentially attempts to give order to disorder, to unreason. If affect is taken in temporal terms as promptitude, as a preconscious readiness to respond and act, then we have to recognize that Trump's frustrating manipulations give rise to heightened anxiety and irrealistic, erotic emotional responses that perpetuate the anxiety or surrender to often false hopes. He becomes for both his supporters and opponents a groundstone, a positive one, for the one a negative and for the other positive. What I want to stress by way of conclusion is that unlike the cognitive vertigo that Candice and other curers produce and exploit in relatively defined and purposeful conditions, the dissonance that Trump produces is by no means so confined. His techniques may work in the narrow context of making a deal in a property transaction or in asking for a bank loan, but where the frame of reference is expansive, multi-resonant, and multi-consequential, extending over time, such tactics are dangerous, for not only do they affect the population at large, but Trump himself. He is not immune to his own cognitive vertigo, the anomie he has produced. He too must seek grounding, a stable vantage point. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why he seems to be attracted to despotic leaders, why he clearly wants their unconstrained power. They, or anyone he depends on, becomes a stabilizing other, which is of course impossible, for in surrendering to another, in reality or in fantasy, Trump loses the very autonomy he desires. He has to destroy them. Danger lies here, where finally he is left to himself in dizzying conditions he himself has created. How then, we have to ask, will he respond, knowing full well that we can't answer the question with any certitude? Thank you.